COVID-19 statistics, as you all know, are quite stark and alarming, and they have provoked an experience of lament, that passionate expression of grief worldwide. When we look at some of those statistics, over 4.8 million cases worldwide, over 300,000 deaths worldwide, over 36 million jobs that have been lost in the US alone, and not to even speak of the loss of human physical interaction. It's overwhelming, it's stark, it's very disturbing. So the experience of lament reveals an overwhelming difficulty in articulating feelings of grief regarding the profound losses in one's life. It also reveals a spiritual need that should and ought to be recognized and fulfilled. Therefore, it makes sense that a spiritual intervention is a necessary component in healing one's grief. Now, another key point to remember as we go through this journey is that grief leaves behind a residue of emptiness that yearns to be filled, but it also leaves behind a burgeoning type of resistance to traditional approaches of healing. For example, counseling and traditional therapy. And that's primarily because of the societal mores towards those types of approaches, especially in communities of color. So let's build on that. Next slide, please. Sometimes there is a tendency to equate the healing efficacy of lament to storytelling. But the truth of the matter is that there is a difference. There's a big difference. While clinical studies have suggested that storytelling is of healing and therapeutic value, some individuals find no comfort to be found in storytelling. And that's primarily because of the intensity of the situations in which people may find themselves. Some losses in life are so intense, so grave, and so discomforting that the crafting of a story can be an overwhelming exercise at best. Sometimes the ability to live through the horrific experience of the loss is all one might be able to withstand. Crafting a story might be an exercise for which a person simply does not have the energy to expend. So we see that storytelling cannot always restore what has been lost in those situations. Therefore, many of those who have engaged in this type of dilemma have argued that when everyday forms of communication fail, it is necessary to speak in new ways. New ways. Next slide. Images and symbols and metaphors are needed that carry the pain of profound grief and loss and articulate it with authenticity and integrity and genuineness. And one of the things that we know is that sacred texts have informed us that in situations such as these, that even the ancient Israelites spoke using images and symbols and metaphors that carried the pain of their profound grief and loss. And they crafted these images and symbols and metaphors into a type of spiritual intervention that enabled healing. So let's build on that. Next, please. Theologian and scholar Walter Brueggemann argues that there are 3 seasons of life through which one traverses. And these seasons include orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. Orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. Orientation represents a period of order, predictability, and stability. We could look at this as our pre-COVID-19 days of orientation. Disorientation, however, represents a period of chaos, a disrupted flow of orderliness and unpredictability. That's what we're in now in COVID-19. And then we look at new orientation, which represents the transformational experience of healing and growth that also does not represent a return to a previous state of orientation, but rather a new and unfamiliar state imbued with a freshness of perspective and insight. And this is what we are hearing now in a lot of spaces as the new normal, the new normal. Brueggemann goes further and he argues that the experience of faith reveals both a movement from orientation to disorientation and a movement from disorientation to new orientation. So let's build on that. Next, please. Again, sacred texts inform us that in those seasons of disorientation, that the ancient Israelites spoke in language that used images and symbols and metaphors that carried the pain of their profound grief and loss. The book of Psalms in the Hebrew Bible encompasses the vast range of emotions experienced by a people who had a relationship with God that was sometimes strong and resilient, but oftentimes very fragile and very tenuous. And in those fragile and tenuous times, they lifted up their laments, their cries to God in the midst of crisis. Their lament was their version of a spiritual intervention towards coping and ultimately towards healing during those times. Specificity was not of paramount importance to the Israelites, but rather a clear articulation of their feelings in the midst of whatever situation in which they found themselves. And their psalms of lament provided a sacred vehicle through which they could complain to God in faith, complaining to God in faith. They were in crisis mode, but they still wanted to remain in relationship with God, a relationship that was tenuous, fragile, frayed, and flawed, but a relationship nonetheless. Next slide, please. So while there are several categories of Psalms in the book of Psalms, the Psalms of thanksgiving, the royal Psalms, the hymns of praise, all of those we're familiar with. But the truth of the matter is that the Lament Psalms represent the largest category, the largest category. They reveal sorrow, pain, and agony. Sorrow, pain, and agony. As Brueggemann would probably suggest, the Lament Psalms arise from seasons of disorientation. But in order to be fully present to the experience of sorrow, pain, and agony in the Lament Psalms, Old Testament German scholar Klaus Westermann suggests 4 assumptions in order for us to really embrace what the Lament Psalms are all about. The first assumption is things are not right in the present arrangement. Things are not right in the present arrangement. Number 2, they need not stay this way and need to be changed. They need not stay this way and need to be changed. Number 3, the speaker will not accept them in this way, for the present arrangement is intolerable. The speaker will not accept them in this way, for the present arrangement is intolerable. And lastly, it is God's obligation to change things. It is God's obligation to change things. So let's take a closer look at the Lament Psalm structure. Next, please. Scholars have identified a primary structure for the Lament Psalm. It includes the following components: the address, the complaint, the petition, the confession of trust, and the vow to praise. The address, the complaint, the petition, the confession of trust, and the vow to praise. Theologian and scholar Denise Domkowski-Hopkins suggests that an analysis of the structure of the Lament Psalm can substantiate arguments in support of the Lament Psalm, providing healing and wholeness to the brokenness of humanity. And she further suggests that each of the components of the Lament Psalm has a purpose and has an expected outcome. So what we're going to do now in the next few slides is we're going to take a more detailed look at each component, after which I will lead you in an exercise to create your own personal lament psalm. So you might want to grab a pen and a piece of paper at this time. So let's build on that. The first component is the address component. And the address component is a short mini statement of faith that conveys the urgency and desperation of the psalmist. A short mini statement of faith that conveys the urgency and desperation of the psalmist. It contains the initial voice of pain and suffering of the psalmist. And it seeks to not only remind God of an existing relationship, but also to draw upon the expectations of that relationship. Again, it wants to remind God of the existing relationship, but also to draw upon the expectations of the relationship. Two examples include Psalm 22, verse 1, a very familiar verse. My God, why have you forsaken me? And also Psalm 13, verses 1 and 2, which is known as the howling psalm. And it's known as the howling psalm because of the repetition of the phrase, how long, how long, how long, how long? How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? The address component. Let's move to the next component, is the complaint. The complaint component is the largest component of the lament psalm, and it seeks to describe the emotional experience of the psalmist using metaphors and symbols and images that may enable the person to whom the psalmist is addressing to emotionally connect and respond with validation and empathy. An example is Psalm 102, verses 3 through 11. And pay attention to the ways in which these images are crafted. For my days pass away like smoke, and my bones burn like a furnace. My heart is stricken and withered like grass. I am too wasted to eat my bread. Because of my loud groaning, my bones cling to my skin. I am like an owl of the wilderness, like a little owl of the waste places. I lie awake. I am like a lonely bird on the housetop. All day long, my enemies taunt me. Those who deride me use my name for a curse. For I eat ashes like bread and mingle tears with my drink. Because of your indignation and anger, for you have lifted me up and thrown me aside. My days are like an evening shadow. I wither away like grass. The complaint. Let's move to the petition. The petition component describes the tangible fulfillment of need as identified by the psalmist, and occasionally it employs various means of motivation to further emphasize the urgency for God to act. Remember, in the midst of the lament psalm, it is about crisis mode. And some of these means of motivation include confession of sin, protestation of innocence, and public relations value of the psalmist. An example that reflects the confession of sin is from Psalm 51, verses 1 and 2, and then verses 10 through 12. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain in me a willing spirit. The petition. The confession of trust enables the psalmist to reflect upon difficult situations in which God has delivered and restored. It enables the psalmist, again, to reflect upon difficult situations in which God has delivered and restored. And this introduces a hope for the future based upon a reality of healing in past experiences. An example is Psalm 59, verse 16. But I will sing of your might. I will sing aloud of your steadfast love in the morning. For you have been a fortress for me and a refuge in the day of my distress. The Confession of Trust. And the vow to praise. Lastly, the vow to praise. The vow to praise clings to the hope as expressed in the Confession of Trust. And it's probably one of the most powerful components in the Lament Psalm structure, for it reveals a faithful commitment to praise the one who is being held responsible for deliverance. An example is Psalm 59, verse 17. O my strength, I will sing praises to you, for you, O God, are my fortress, the God who shows me steadfast love. Notice the use of the future tense of the word, I will sing praises to you. So let's go to the next slide. So now, as I promised earlier, I give you an opportunity in engaging this exercise of crafting your own personal lament psalm, your own personal lament psalm. So the first thing that I invite you to do is to think of just one season of disorientation in your life, a time in your life when everything was turned upside down. There was chaos, there was confusion, there was no predictability whatsoever. Nothing was stable. Feel free to use COVID-19, of course, but I'm not going to restrict you to that. Feel free to use any season of disorientation in your life. So take a moment and jot down on your piece of paper one season of disorientation for which we're going to build our personal lament psalm. All right, now that you have your season of disorientation identified, let's look at the first component, which is the address. Let's craft an address component. And you can think of it like this. You're in your private prayer closet in the midst of your season of disorientation. Keep in mind about that now. And God comes into your private prayer closet and taps you on the shoulder. What are the first words out of your mouth to God? And remember, you are not in a praise moment. You're in your season of disorientation. So what do you say to God? And it can be something very short, like how long or why or what? Very short. So let's take a moment and craft your address component for your season of disorientation. All right, now let's build on that. Let's move to the complaint component. Remember, in the complaint component, we're going to paint a picture of your emotions using symbols and images and metaphors. But the first thing I want you to do is to identify one overarching feeling or emotion that you experienced in the midst of your season of disorientation. Identify just one feeling or emotion that you experienced in your season of disorientation. And let me give you an example. You could say you're scared, you're angry, frustrated, disappointed, saddened, all of that. And then after you've identified that feeling, I want you to paint that picture. And let me give you an example of that. One of the feelings that I have experienced in my seasons of disorientation is a feeling of being scared or afraid. And so if I'm talking to someone that has never really experienced being afraid or scared, I might paint a picture like this. I'm scared like a 5-year-old boy separated from his mother in a crowded mall at Christmas time. That paints a picture for you. So take a moment and craft your complaint portion. All right, let's build on that. Let's move to the petition component. What do you want from God? In the midst of your season of disorientation, what do you want from God? And you can be as high level as you like. Support, healing, comfort, grace, encouragement, empowerment, enlightenment. What do you want from God in the midst of your season of disorientation? Take a moment and let's write that down. All right, let's build on that. Let's move to the confession of trust. Think of a time when God has come through for you. Think of a time when God has come through for you and you say, Lord, when I think of how you delivered me in the past, think of a time when God has come through for you. And let's document that. Let's write that down as your confession of trust. And let's take a moment for that. All right, and let's build on that in our last component, the vow to praise. Reword this statement in your own words. In your own words. Even though I have not experienced deliverance, I will praise you just because. And of course, you want to use that future tense. I will praise you, even though I have not been delivered. Lord, I'm going to praise you just because. So take just a moment or two and reword that so that it reflects your voice. All right. So I encourage you to further develop your personal lament psalm in the days to come. Again, you can put it within the context of COVID-19 or any season of disorientation. I'd like to share with you, I can't ask you to create your own personal lament psalm without sharing something that I created as well. So I'll share with you and my personal lament psalm, and this was within the context of COVID-19. How long, O Lord, how long How long will this virus dictate the ins and outs of my life? How long will I live in uncertainty and in the great unknown? How long, O Lord, how long? I feel frustrated, like a visitor to a foreign country, not knowing the language, and everyone that I encounter having no patience with me. I feel anxious and scared, like hearing a disturbing sound in a dark room and not being able to exit to safety because every door that I try is locked. I feel sad, like a young child who has lost his parents to an untimely death. Please grant me hope so that I might have the strength to endure whatever I must endure to, at last, experience your divine surprise. Please grant me a lightness of spirit so that I might be open to hearing your voice and feeling your love wherever I may go. Please energize joy within me so that I might navigate these times in ways that are healthy. For Lord, I'm running on low and need a spark from you to rejuvenate. But, when I remember the times when you healed my body from unexpected illnesses, when you mended my heart from dysfunctional and broken relationships, and when you kept me sane in the midst of what seemed to be impossible situations, I can't help but step out on my faith and my relationship with you, whatever the texture of that relationship might be. And I will praise you for being God now and forevermore. Amen. My last slide. It's an understatement that we are living in a grieving world. COVID-19 has hurled us into a space that is both unfamiliar and dangerous on so many different levels. And while stay-at-home mandates have provided opportunities for families to spend quality time with each other, and Zoom technology has enabled us to connect with family and friends in ways that we had not capitalized upon in the past, at the end of the day, we're grieving because we have experienced profound losses in our lives. So late in the midnight hour, we are invited to lament and cry to God together in hope that God will hear and provide that which we need for such a time as this. Thank you so much for your presence and blessings upon you all.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. And we are recording these sessions, and people were asking to get the list and also get the scriptures that you read. So we will make all that available because this is about trying to help people have tools to do this work. So just everybody know we'll post where you can find all of that. So those of us that are here in this webinar are the fortunate people who have resources, and we're people of privilege. And we have an opportunity to be sitting in front of computers, listening to people talk about lament. But there are so many of our sisters and brothers that don't have that luxury. Many of them live outdoors and have nowhere to live. Many of them live in prison. Many of them find themselves having to do the low wage jobs that are keeping the rest of us able to be able to practice social distancing and home quarantining. And it is really clear to me that we are a culture of people who have folks that we consider to be expendable. And so we are going to spend some time now talking a little bit about some of those folks that we consider that are candidates to be expendable. However, we like to play funny games. So we play the funny game of saying, the low wage worker, the garbage truck driver, the person collecting our grocery at the grocery store is essential. But that's actually a person that's expendable to us and only essential to let us keep living as best we can the way we've always lived. we people of faith have got to step up to the plate and say, there is no expendable person on the planet. Nowhere is there an expendable person. And we don't get to just call people essential so we can have a better conscience about expending them. And so each one of these sessions is going to look at categories of people that we have labeled that way and highlight them and talk about their plight and carry them in our hearts in ways that help them not to be expended, because we don't have any people that are candidates for that. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Reverend Kim Jackson, who is vicar for the Church of the Common Ground. And for those of you that live outside of the Atlanta area, she will explain what she does. Those living here should know what she does. And I'm so honored to have Kim come and be with us for this part of this webinar, because of her heart and commitment, and absolutely always being on record for bearing witness to the fact that there are no expendable people. Kim, welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Well, I want to begin by thanking Dr. Meeks for this opportunity to speak with you all, and to Dr. Reverend Robert Phillips, thank you so much for such an important reflection and opportunity to really pause, to lament and grieve. This is a season in which lament, I believe, is the only appropriate response to where we stand. And so Dr. Meeks mentioned, I am the vicar of the Church of the Common Ground. And for those of you who are not familiar with Common Ground, it's a congregation without walls. We meet in a park in downtown Atlanta, and about 90% of my congregants, those who join with me, are experiencing homelessness. They are unsheltered or living in temporary shelters. And so each week we gather, and even in the midst of this pandemic, we don't gather for worship, but we do continue to gather to eat together, because one thing that is essential, no matter where we are in our lives, we have to have food. And so the Diocese of Atlanta, through the Church of the Common Ground and our partner churches, we continue to provide food on Sundays in the same park at the same time to a group of wonderfully resilient, powerful, and incredible people that I feel incredibly blessed to be able to serve and to be served by, quite frankly. Dr. Meeks, do you have questions for me, or I can just keep talking?
Well, just keep talking.
Yeah, so I think a few things as I was listening to Dr. Phillips' reflection on lament. I was thinking a lot about the people that I get to be with on Sundays, and how they don't have space to lament because they're trying to survive. And I grew up in a Black Baptist context where there was this song that we used to sing. My grandmother would sing it. It said, "Somebody prayed for me. Somebody had me on their mind. They took the time and prayed for me. I'm so glad they prayed." And as I thought about, what does it mean to be in a space where survival is your fundamental purpose and goal, so you can't pause and really cry out in the ways that perhaps one would want to. I think we have a responsibility to pray for those who are unsheltered or who are in unstable housing. I think that's one of the things that we can do. And I want to be able to actually go back to the Church of the Common Ground and say, listen, y'all, somebody is praying for you. We have you on our minds, and we're taking the time to grieve and to lament and to cry out, oh God, how long, on your behalf and with you and for you, because we still see you. And so that's just something that came to me as I was listening to this whole process of what it means for us to lament, and the importance of us lamenting on behalf of and with and for one another.
Yes. And would you be able to talk a little bit about the particular circumstances of how are people doing? Are they getting sick? We don't have any information about your parishioners.
Yeah, so I can speak specifically to my context in Atlanta and to folks that I normally see. So people who are experiencing homelessness are getting sick, not in massive numbers, which we're grateful for. We've had 9 diagnosed cases. There has been 1 death. Now, let me be clear, just because they've been diagnosed and reported doesn't mean that those numbers are accurate. This is Georgia, friends. I have no doubt that there are more cases, but those are the numbers that are being reported to us publicly. Certainly the man who did die, who succumbed to COVID-19, is a member of a partner church of ours, actually, of Mercy Church. And he's in a population that we would describe as chronically homeless. And so there are different types of people who are experiencing homelessness. Some are situational, right? And quite frankly, I think we need to be prepared, Dr. Makes, for a lot more of situational homelessness that we'll see as rent evictions. Right now there's a moratorium on evictions, but when that ends, I anticipate seeing an increase in those folks who find themselves homeless. And then there's also this chronic homelessness piece. And the majority of my congregants are in that chronically homeless category. They've been experiencing homelessness for 2 to 10 to 20 years. And, early in the epidemic, I did an interview with someone, and it was just as the shelter-in-place order came about in Georgia. And I said, quite exasperately, what does it mean to shelter in place when you have no shelter? What does that mean? And I can tell you now what it means. It means that you continue to sleep outside in a park, or maybe you find a tent and you get in a tent with 2 or 3 or 4 other people, and you hope and pray that they aren't carrying COVID-19, right? In the first 3-4 weeks of this pandemic, people who were experiencing homelessness were hungry. It used to be said that if you were without a shelter in Atlanta, while we may not be able to fulfill your needs for shelter, there was one thing that we could promise, and it was that you would never go hungry in Atlanta if you lived on the streets. But when the shelter in place order came down and people began to stay home, particularly people of goodwill, right? It's faith communities like Church of Common Ground, like the Diocese of Atlanta, and so many other Christian and non-Christian organizations. We're the ones who have been feeding people who are living on the streets. And so when people of goodwill sheltered in place for their own safety, for the first 3 weeks of this pandemic, people were hungry in a way that I had never seen before. And so Atlanta has managed, I think, to finally create a system in which we're able to address that need fairly well. But in those early weeks, it was clear to me that nobody had seen that people who were homeless, right? Like, they were invisible. And so we had to go to city council and say, hey, there are literally thousands of people who are living on our streets who are hungry. And we need to address that. So that's something that's been dealt with. We've really struggled with getting hand washing stations. So I read a lot about what's happening in other homelessness communities. And there were a number of cities who early on went and put hand washing stations in their city parks and added encampments where they knew people were. And we've been slower to have that happen. I'll actually give Easton a shout out here while we're here. The Diocese of Atlanta, there was some type of conference that was supposed to happen, and the little takeaway was going to be hand sanitizer. What was it, Easton?
It was the Hunger Walk. It was a Hunger Walk run that got canceled. That was the first big ticket item that got canceled in Atlanta when this started.
Yeah, and so we suddenly found ourselves in possession with a lot of hand sanitizer that had the Diocese of Atlanta logo on it that we were able to distribute. But to someone who's living on the streets and doesn't have access to water, that amount of hand sanitizer lasts, a day or two. I think another thing I want to highlight in the midst of this, so those of us who are on this call, we have access to an immense amount of information. Right, so whether we choose to get it via the internet or our televisions, we more or less know what's happening. And I'll tell you, the first 2, 3, 4 weeks that I was going out there were people who were looking at me with my mask and my gloves on and saying, "What is going on? Why are you wearing these?" The access to information is so vastly limited, and so folks who are living on the streets had no idea that their lives were at risk. They knew they were hungry. They knew that downtown had been deserted, but they had no idea what was really happening as it related to this disease. And so information vacuum, the lack of access to information is a huge issue that people are facing, and they continue to face it, particularly in my congregation.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the prisons, because you have close ties with that population and that world, and prisoners and homeless people. If we were going to set up who's going to be at the very bottom, they definitely will be at the very bottom.
Right. And, I think it's also important to note that a number of people who are experiencing homelessness have been in prison at some point. They've been a part of the carceral system. So here's what I know from other people that I work with and from my own parishioners is that being in jail or in prison right now is more dangerous than ever before, because there is no ability to socially isolate. Think about, you're in a cell usually with 4, maybe 6 people in the same cell with you, and you can't isolate from them. I was talking to a friend who was saying that, he called his loved one who was in prison, and she was like, I'm not eating anything in the cafeteria right now because, there's no protections, right? Like, you have to touch somebody to get your tray because somebody hands you your tray, and then, there are 4 or 5 people on the line who are serving you food, and so there's that exposure there, and, it just kind of amplifies. And so she's like, so I've just been eating from the commissary. And obviously that's not sustainable, but that's, one of the ways that she was trying to make it through. I want to highlight one thing that has happened. So if you're in prison or in jail, typically you have to pay on the phone to talk on the phone, and you pay. So, Dr. Meeks, I can call you for essentially like minus pennies on the dollar, right? Anytime I want to, it basically costs me nothing. But to talk to an inmate, to talk to someone who is incarcerated, it costs real money. And during this pandemic, somehow we've found the money to be able to allow people who are in prison to talk on the phone for an hour a week. I want to highlight that, because if we can do that now during a pandemic, then we could have been doing that all along. And if we can eliminate that barrier so that families can be in touch with their loved ones and not be financially exploited, if we can do that today, then we could have been doing that all along. And as I hope for a new future, and where we continue to do that, so that families can stay connected, people can stay connected to their loved ones.
And I actually noticed, I've been keeping up in the news a little bit with some of the, I think in Iowa and a couple of other places where prisoners were actually revolting a little bit because they had no protection of any sort and no real access to any real medical testing, or if they got sick, I don't really know what happened to them. And then I had actually put in a call before this webinar to the Atlanta prison system here to ask for somebody from communications to come and share with us, and they never called me back. So that sort of let me know they either too busy or don't really want to talk about this. But I just think that as we are praying for people and doing our own laments, that we need to hold these folks in our hearts in some very special ways. Because as you've said, if you are just struggling to survive, you don't have time to even catch up with how much sorrow you've got. Because every day you've got to get up thinking how you're going to get food and where you're going to wash your hands. And if you get sick, is anybody even going to know it? And is anybody even going to care? And I don't, I want to lament myself about that plight, because that's the world we've helped to make. And I think as we move forward, that this is a world we've got to confront and say, no, it's unacceptable. That we have got to build, as my mentor Vincent Harding would say, we've got to build a new world. Right. We've got to build up a new world, and we've got to build up a new world where people are treated better than this.
Yeah, and a new world where builders must be strong. And, you know, as we pray, I'm always thinking about, you know, what are some action steps? So I believe that prayer fundamentally is the most powerful action that we can take. That I believe in a God who is huge and abundant and can do all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that one of the ways that we pray is through using our mouths to speak to the powers that be. And I just want to, Catherine, if you don't mind, I'd like to say a few things about the ways that we could make this plight a little easier, you know, save from actually putting people in housing, which is the fundamental thing that we need to do. But in my city, and I believe this is probably true across the country, so folks who are experiencing homelessness, some of them often have phones. They call them Obama phones. They came during that era. And before the pandemic, they could charge those cell phones at a Starbucks or, you know, some place that was open, the public library. Well, those places are closed now for the most part. And so my community started charging their cell phones in the parks, in the public parks, because there are outlets that they have to, you know, turn lights on and things like that. So a cruelty that I think happened in our city was that they turned the power off in the park, so that people who are experiencing homelessness could no longer charge their phones, which means they could no longer communicate, no longer get the information that they need. So, right, so that's like something really simple. It's a call to your city council to say, leave the power on. This is one kindness that we can do. And there are all kinds of people say, well, they can't physically distance from one another if they're all charging their phones. They can figure that out. What I've learned from my friends who are living on the streets is that they are smart and resilient and they're creative. They can figure that out. The least we can do is leave the power on. You know, and so it's small things like that, or locking up the bathrooms in our MARTA stations so that people, I mean, if you imagine you sleep on the street, you know, where do you go to the bathroom in the morning when all the stores are closed in downtown? And then we in turn turn around and lock up all the MARTA bathrooms so that people can't access the bathrooms at the train station. So these are like some simple kindnesses, I think, that we can really use our voices to advocate for across whatever city you're in, to help make sure that there's some resources. It's the small things like that that can help make a person's life just a little easier.
Yes. So I think that one of the major takeaways that we'll have from this COVID-19 pandemic is a clearer awareness of how bankrupt we are as a culture, how bankrupt we are, how we have turned ourselves over to the systems that are dehumanizing and denigrating. And I believe that people of faith cannot abide that without speaking up and standing up and calling it what it is. And so, you know, it's been said that if you want to know what a culture is like, go look at how they treat their prisoners. And I would add the homeless people. And if you look at the way we treat our prisoners and homeless people, it says a lot about who we are. And we have to ask ourselves, I'm asking myself every day, who do I want to be when I'm at another place here? Who do I want to be? And I know what I want to be is more radical than I have ever been in my life. Speaking up for the miseries that have no mouths, because I have a mouth and I can speak. And I want to not be concerned about anything except telling that truth as powerfully as possible. So I think we've spent a good time here now talking about these two categories of people. We'll be talking about others as in the next webinars. We'll have some other categories of folks that will be highlighted. But before we move to the question and answer section, I want to invite everybody to make a contribution to the Center for Racial Healing if you are able to do that. And I think that our moderator will put up how you can do that very easily. We are choosing not to charge for any of the things we're doing, but we do have to raise money to keep the doors open. And we do a whole lot on very little money because we know how to make a dollar go a long way. So if you can contribute, we would love to have you do that. And also these webinars will be recorded, and we'll have where you can find them so you can share them with people that were not able to join us today. And then we want to invite you. I think that Easton is going to ferret through the questions, and we'll see what questions people have asked, and all of us will be available to speak to your questions. You might indicate who you want to answer the question if you have it for a particular person. If not, then just a general question. And we'll just do that for a little bit, and then we'll be coming to the end of our time together. So, Easton.
All right, our first question is from Cynthia Pease from Sheffield, Massachusetts, to the Rev. Kim Jackson. Are you involved with the Poor People's Campaign?
Hi. Yes, I've had some involvement with the Poor People's Campaign. Unfortunately, we actually had planned to take a group this summer to the Poor People's Campaign. There's a march, I think, that happens in the summertime, and so that was on our list of things to do. That obviously won't happen. But you know, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Poor People's Campaign, it's began in the 60s, actually. This is a long-standing campaign to end poverty. And I believe that that's work that we are all called to. And I believe that it's work that each of us needs to be invested in order to help change the world.
All right, and so far that is the only question at this time. And if it's easier for you, if you don't want to use the Q&A component, you can also raise your hand. And if you click on the participants tab and you raise your hand, then we can also call on you to ask your question aloud.
While people are still thinking about their questions, I'd like to add that there's some opportunities that we have as a nation when it relates to caring for people who are imprisoned, and one of those is simply letting them out. And so I want to shout out the Southern Center for Human Rights. They have been working diligently to do some decarceration. So in Georgia, which is where I can speak about specifically because I know a lot of details about how Georgia works, there is a clemency panel, and people who are over the age of 60 can receive clemency by virtue of their age, and particularly now as we are in this time, because they are a high risk. And our board, our clemency board, has made choices not to do that. But there are other states who have released people there. And if we think about, I also just want to highlight jails as well. So people who are in jail have not been convicted of a crime. Like, that's how jail works. They have not been convicted of a crime. They're being held there until they can have trial, which trials have been delayed or not happening. And so there's an opportunity there, again, to decarcerate people, to send them home where it's safer while they wait for things to open back up. And so I encourage folks who care about these things to really push for decarceration. I think that's one step towards ending mass incarceration, and this is a great opportunity for us to take that.
Okay, so our next question is from Ashley Salmon. Dr. Meeks, do you have any publications regarding your work with racial healing?
Well, yes. A couple of books, Living into God's Dream, Dismantling Racism in America, has been out a couple years. And then my latest book, Passionate for Justice, Ida B. Wells is a Prophet for Our Time, I would refer you to. And I write a lot on Facebook, a lot of posts about issues that have to do with racial healing and justice and grieving and all kinds of things. So please just check those things out. Go to the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing website, which is centerforracialhealing.org, and you will find things there as well. And I'm always open to being contacted via email to make suggestions, to brainstorm, or whatever.
All right, our next question is from Tricia DeBeer. For each of the panelists, how does lament happen in your spiritual practice?
So why don't we let Dr. Phillips go first?
Okay, you know, the whole notion behind the Lament Psalm was birthed in me when I was in divinity school. I had experienced health in my physical being, if you will. And all of a sudden, in my first year in divinity school, I had a herniated disc. And if you've ever experienced chronic pain, that is something that you never want to have. It's the type of thing that It wakes up with you. You walk around with it all day, and you take it to bed at night. And it was horrible. It was horrible. And so as it turned out, it was around the same time that I was learning about the Lament Psalm from my Old Testament professor. I did not intentionally try to create my own personal lament psalm in the midst of it all, but that's what I ended up doing. I truly was complaining to God in faith, because I knew God was probably going to be the only one that could help me out in this situation. So, but I needed God to know what I was feeling, what I was going through. And so that was my first real invitation to being able to identify my feelings, not saying, well, I'm like this, like, I am frustrated, I am hurting, I am sad. I was able to really articulate that. And so that has played itself out in every aspect of my life ever since. And that's been about 20 years. So.
Yeah. And I think that I pay a lot of attention to the suffering on the planet, and I lament a lot. And my lament it's not quite as nice as the way Dr. Phillips laid it out, because some of it is just, screaming and hollering and being, as a matter of fact, I remember one of the most striking times of lament for me was when I went out in the countryside with a big bag full of bricks and a hammer and just beat the bricks into a pulp. That was lament. That was making it clear to God that I was just really fed up. And, I've had to come to the conclusion that God could take it. And so that I could say, because in the first place, God already knew what I was thinking. So if I was not saying it, who was I trying to hide from? So I'm a regular lamenter. But I want my lamenting to not just turn into bitching. I want it to be empowering. I want it to be a release so that I'm set free to then go do what I need to do.
Yeah, I'll say for me, I don't lament as much as I perhaps could. Maybe my soul actually would be in a better condition if I did it more. I think I have for so long, Dr. Phillips, listening to your presentation was really helpful. For a long time, I have really focused on like the end of the part of the lament where it's like, help me to praise you because you've always been great and you've always delivered me. And so that has been my nature, is to go to that part and to kind of bypass naming. I'm not always good with naming before God all of the anger and the frustration that I have. And so I think that my spirit actually will be enhanced by taking this ritual and this tradition more into my soul. So thank you for your presentation.
All right. The next question we got is from Mary Kisner from Lebanon, Pennsylvania. Aside from the March for the Poor People's Campaign, I believe they switched it to a virtual presence. Okay, so that was just about they've got a virtual online march for the Poor People's Campaign. Next question we've got, these are people just kind of going for that. All right, this is for you, Reverend Phillips. Are you familiar with Dr. Pauline Boss's work with ambiguous grief and its applicability for today?
Yeah, I am familiar with the work. When it comes to ambiguous grief, that is so very, very rough, and it typically creates a lot of complicated grief. Ambiguous grief it's the loss, when a loss occurs and you have no closure and you have no understanding about it. And so a loved one might die and you've had all types of conflicts with that particular person. And you don't know what to do. You don't know what to do because you want to, at that point, you want to be able to resolve your issues. You want to be able to put a nice, pretty little bow on the box. And the truth of the matter is that that's not always available for us to do. As much as we would love for that to happen, it's just not always available. So one of the things that I have encouraged the people with whom I serve is to think about grief and loss in this particular way, that we're houses, that we represent a house. And from time to time, life is going to come to our house and knock on our door with a package. And we don't have any option except to take that package. Sometimes that package is beautiful and glorious and all of that. Sometimes it's just horrible. And it's very intense, it's very grave. And our task is to receive that package and place it in one of the rooms in our house. And depending upon the intensity and the profundity of that package, it probably will wind up initially in your living room. Well, the truth of the matter as well is that time passes, you get another knock, knock, knock from life, you got another package that is probably more sensational than the one that you received previously, and there's no room in your living room, so you have to move that thing that was in your living room to your dining room or whatever. And so you get the understanding. The thing about it is that we have to learn ways to accommodate our grief and our loss, because we can't ignore it. We can't pretend like it didn't happen, because it did. So when it comes in particularly to ambiguous loss, we just have to do the best that we can, receive that in all of its complexity, all of its harsh reality, and try to place it somewhere in our house, in our way of being, such that it is not causing a toxic reaction in our lives. Recognize it for what it is, and then try to move through it, and then receive whatever life is going to give you in the next moment. And life will always give you something different in the next moment.
Right.
All right. Next question we have, and I answered it, but it's from Janice, and I sent the link so all participants can see the answered questions for links and such. But Catherine, it was about the podcast. Just wanting a little bit more information about your new podcast, A Brave Space with Dr. Meeks.
In terms of how to access it, or I don't know. It's available.
Yeah, I went over access, but maybe it's good to talk a little bit about what you're doing right now. Is some of the new conversations are relating to what we're talking about in the webinar.
Well, the thing that I've decided during this pandemic era was to try to increase my footprint virtually for the center and for the words that I have to get out. The podcast, the 3-minute videos that I publish each week on Facebook, that you can find as well by going either to my public figure page or to the Center for Racial Healing Facebook page or to the YouTube channel. And the podcasts, the webinars, the post, everything is really trying to be about raising this voice that says we have to do the first things first. We have to grieve, we have to be enraged, we have to do whatever we need to do to make it through this space we're in right now. We have to live in the present moment. We cannot jump over this moment or hold our breath, as I said in the beginning, to hold our breath till we can get past this. We cannot have that as our model. And so the podcasts are twice a month, and everything is about trying to find brave spaces. Trying to find spaces where, as my poet friend David White would say, where we can be a half a shade braver. Every day, can we just be a half a shade braver? So everything that is being done right now is to hold that up as something we're trying to strive for. So I don't know, beyond that, I don't know what else to say about it.
I will just say we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast so that you get updates as they come out. Keep up with Dr. Meeks through her public figure page at Dr. Catherine Meeks on Facebook. So those are great ways to stay connected, as well as the Facebook page for the Center for Racial Healing. Our next question is from LaFawn. And how do you balance the acts of lamenting and practicing gratitude? Is one better than the other?
So I want Dr. Phillips to answer all the lament questions.
But we all connect with this. We all connect with this. But I guess my initial reaction to that is that, when you are lamenting, when you are truly lamenting, you are being very honest with God. You are honoring the relationship that you have with God. You're not just railing for the sake of railing, because that borders on being blasphemous. We're not looking at that. So, I think that one of the things that we had to remember, as the ancient Israelites experienced as well, and we're going through it now, is that our relationships with God, with others, and with ourselves has varying textures depending upon the situations in which we find ourselves. And so sometimes you're going to be filled with gratitude. You're going to be in that space. Sometimes you're not going to be filled with gratitude. You're going to be filled with anger. And anger, truth of the matter, is that that's really a manifestation of two feelings. The feelings being deepest hurt and greatest fear. So I think that one of the things that we have to remember is that we have to be gentle with ourselves in knowing that, you know, I'm going through this right now, and that's okay. Oftentimes we don't feel comfortable in being in those spaces of dis-ease, if you will, especially when we're talking with God. But God honors that. God honors that because God wants honest relationship with us. Gratitude, wonderful. Lament, wonderful. It's not an either or, it's a both and.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this question will be for you, Kim, and it's more of a comment, but I think that there's something you'll be able to say to it. But as this pandemic ends, I see an opportunity to provide more housing for our homeless individuals and families by seeking and leasing unused commercial space. The vacancy rate for some buildings will be significant in all of our cities, and that's from Rosemarie.
Yeah, so I think that that's right, that people are going to work from home. They've discovered that it's possible, and so commercial spaces will be open. But also, I want to be clear, even before the pandemic, it was never about us not having enough space. There's always been enough room in the inn, quite frankly. It has been about whether or not we would allow people to stay in the inn. And so that is really, when we move forward, we have to push those who have power, and we are people who have power, to say, you know, we have vacant houses that have been boarded up for a long time, and actually, quite frankly, people who are unsheltered have been choosing to use those homes. You know, there's always been space. And I think one of the things I've learned most clearly through this pandemic is that there actually has also been enough money. For so long, we have been told, as you know, as I think so many of us have tried to imagine a new world, we've been told that that world was not possible because there wasn't enough money. And as I watch cities all across this nation rent out entire hotels indefinitely to house people, that let me know for sure that there is enough money. When I received a notice from my health insurance company that all COVID-related illness would be covered at 100%, that let me know there is enough money, right? So this new world that we've been imagining, that we've been talking about, and you know, that people have been saying it was not possible because we didn't have enough money or we didn't have enough space. No. We've always had enough. That is, quite frankly, the God that we serve is a God of abundance who provides us with enough. And so this move now is an opportunity for us to say, you all tried to convince us that there wasn't enough, and we can see it clear as day now. And so we've got to push to make sure that we actually access that which is now open and available for us.
All right, next question.
And
go ahead, Catherine.
Just a second before you go to the next question, I did just want to add one other little piece to the question before about lament and gratitude, because I think gratitude is an amazingly liberating energy field. But I think that what we try to do is use gratitude to keep from doing lamenting. We think that, oh, well, you know, the thing that's vividly stuck in my mind is people after the slaughter at Mother Emanuel trying to be grateful and forgiving rather than just being grief-stricken and sad and lamenting. It was not the time when your child has been shot in front of your face. It's not the time to be grateful. It's not, you know, you can, I mean, it may be the time, but you're not going to be capable of it. And so until you grieve, until you own up to that space, gratitude is harder to come by. But gratitude is very liberating, but it's got to be grounded in that's the space you're in. And I think that a lot of times we have tried to be okay because that's what the culture thinks, that's what the culture demands, rather than I'm just not okay. I'm just not okay. And the church has got to be a place where we can let people just not be okay until they can be okay, without criticism, without critique, without judgment. And that's missing in a lot of places. So, okay.
And if I could share just one more piece about that before we move to the next question, that is such a powerful statement, in that one of the realities about the Lament Psalms is that not all of the Lament Psalms have all 5 of the components in it. Because what you just said is absolutely true. Sometimes you are just not going to get to that space of vow to praise. Maybe not even being able to confess your trust in God, because you've been beaten down so hard that you can't even remember it at all. And a prime example of that is Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we hung up our harps and wept. And that particular psalm ends in the most horrific image of dashing the necks of your babies against the rocks because of what you've done to us. So there are times that's just where you are. That's where you are. And again, God honors that as we express with honesty our true emotions, what we're going through. So,
yes, thank you.
Okay, so another question focused on lament here, but at a corporate level, guidance for using lament and dealing with it on a corporate level, such as a church with COVID-19 changes.
Well, I've done that on several occasions and working with parishes here in the diocese. And I truly engage them in the same exercises I engaged you in this afternoon, in asking yourself, you all in your private prayer closet in the middle of what you're going through, what are the first words out of your mouth if God were to tap you on your shoulder? Think about all of the feelings, all of the emotions that you have. I will create a whiteboard. I'll have a whiteboard and fill that whiteboard up with feelings and emotions that are just chock full of energy and rage along the way. And then crafting the whole complaint portion. Then what do you want? What do you want from God? So it's a very applicable exercise to congregations as well as on an individual level. Yes. So keep in touch with me. I'll be glad to come and help you out.
And Easton, can we put up Dr. Phillips's contact information?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do that in the chat before we close today. I was going to point them to that chat. It'd be one of the closing things that we put in there is contact information. And I'm also going to send out, I'll just say it now, that we'll send out contact information as well as some links to the center, where to give, Church of the Common Ground, all that stuff in a follow-up email that we'll get out, if not today, tomorrow. Okay, let's see. We've got about 7 minutes left. We've got a question right here. Go ahead, Catherine.
I was going to say, let's do one more and then.
Okay, so this one, and I've been trying to just kind of go back and forth between the two, but here we go for Kim. This is a question about conditions of the prisons. I've heard those who are incarcerated have to pay for going to see a doctor. And then, so there's that question, and another question about, are the folks who are homeless getting enough to eat? So those are the two questions.
Yeah, let me address the second one first. Again, I can speak for the context of Atlanta. People are getting enough to eat. One of the things that I hope we can see as we move forward is that a number of the organizations we've all been serving people who are experiencing homelessness for a long time, but this has actually forced us to get together. And so now there's actually a grid, an entire spreadsheet that shows which organization is feeding on what day and what location. And so I am happy to report that through a network of about 25 of us, there is food being delivered to every encampment that we know of, and to the parks 3 times a day, 7 days a week. And so people are getting food. Common Ground is a part of that grid. Church Crossroads Ministries, which is hosted out of St. Luke's, is also a part of that grid. And so I'm happy to say that. On the piece about prisoners and things that they're charged for, in Georgia, I've not been told that was the case, that people had to be charged to visit. But people do get bills when they leave prison. They get charged for their food. They get charged for toilet paper, for toothbrushes. I can't tell you. So, we have a shortage of toilet paper here. They're literally like doling out toilet paper and charging people on their books for toilet paper, for toothbrush and toothpaste, actually basic essentials that we all need in order to live. People do get bills for that. And that stuff does get taken off of their books. And I know that's true in Georgia. It's across the nation. And so we're not even willing, even though people who are prisoners are considered wards of the state. They're considered to be, for lack of a better term, owned by the state. That's what it means to be imprisoned, and yet we don't provide for their basic needs without sending them a bill. That's a very common practice. And so again, when it comes to prison reform and activism and advocacy, there's a lot of work that we can do. And first and foremost, though, for me, it's always about de-incarceration. Let's get as many people as we can out of that place while we also seek to reform for those who are still there.
Yes. And I think we should probably stop at that point, don't you think, Easton? Because we're getting right close to 5:30, and we really want to honor people's commitment of the time they've made here. We will go through the questions, and if there's some things that we can answer, you can find those answers at the website for the Center for Racial Healing. We'll post them there, the responses. I cannot tell all of you who've joined us how much this means to us, that you have taken this time to come and be with us for this hour and a half. Next week, we will be doing the second webinar, looking at lament in a little bit of a different way, and looking at another group of folks that we have designated as expendable. And then the final week, we will be joined by Bishop Rob Wright, our bishop here in the Diocese of Atlanta, who will be leading us to talk about lament. And we will be looking at our Native Indigenous sisters and brothers and our undocumented sisters and brothers, because these are all people that have been made in the image of God and loved equally by God as we are loved. And we have relegated them to third and fourth and fifth class citizenship. It cannot be that we continue that. We have got to not do it. I want to just take a second and say thank you to Easton Davis, because I am this old lady who has really stepped up to the technology plate, because Easton has been an amazing mentor and supporter and helper. And if you are in your 70s like I am and feeling hesitant about using your imagination to move forward in whatever ways God is calling you to use your imagination, I want to bear witness to the fact that you can hook up with a millennial and then let yourself go with them and trust that they know a few things you don't know. And Easton says that it does his heart good to see me as an old lady so excited about what I'm learning. And I am excited. I've really have done some things that surprised myself with this. So thank you, Easton. Thank you, Dr. Phillips. Thank you, Reverend Kim Jackson. Thank you, everybody who signed in. Please tell other people about the subject of this webinar and invite other folks to join us for the upcoming ones, and then to go to our YouTube channel and find the recordings if you want to listen to parts of it again, or to tell people about it that didn't get a chance to join us, and go to the Center for Racial Healing's website to find out other things about what we are doing. So any last sentence from anybody else on the panel?
Again, it's just been a blessing to be here and to share and to learn from Reverend Jackson, from Dr. Meeks, from Easton. I mean, this has been really great. This is some wonderful energy that I think we need, that will enable us to be refreshed. We need a refreshment these days in the midst of all of the muck and mire that we're going through. So I'm filled with gratitude. I also lament some stuff, but I got my gratitude too. So. Thank you.
Yeah, and I simply add my words of gratitude to Dr. Meeks for dreaming this up and building this ship while we're on it. And I will just conclude with those same words that I started with, encouraging and asking, well, please pray for those whom you often don't see. I want to be able to tell them it's not just me, but there's a whole community of people who are praying for you, who we have you on our minds, and we're taking the time to go to God in prayer about you. So please do continue to remember our siblings who are on the streets and in prisons in your prayers.
God bless.
God bless.
Goodbye.
We'll see you next week.